the survey report itself, rather than wading through the whole report, we thought, let's just pull some of our best practices, let's pull some of the best relevant pieces and put it in the presentation and walk through it together. And so this will be a bit of a summary. And what I thought I would do, with your permission, is give you a little more context. Rather than just share raw data, that may not be as meaningful to you as if I could give you a little bit of context and treat this a little bit like a developmental process for you as creating some value for you as leaders. Does that work? Okay? Okay, good. That's what I was hoping. And I set my computer there because last time I was here, I was going back and forth and it drove me nuts. So now I can see what I'm looking at. This work is based on the book called The Speed of Trust, authored by a man called Stephen M. R. Covey. He's the oldest son of the late Dr. Stephen R. Covey, who's famous for the 7 Habits book, which is, by the way, going to be 27 years old this spring. It's just unbelievable. Stephen M. R. Covey was the president and CEO of Covey Leadership Center back in the 90s, and oversaw a merger with, as you probably know, Franklin Quest up in Salt Lake. And what we thought was a match made in heaven was a complete disaster. It was a mess in every form and every way possible. And Stephen was caught right in the middle of it as the CEO. So the long and short of the story is, that's really what the beginnings of this idea of trust in the workplace. And if we were to sit here and talk quickly about what trust is and everybody were to offer their definitions of it, we'd get as many different answers as there are people. And so when you get that many answers, what do you do about that? I mean, if it's a trust matters in the workplace, then we really need to get our arms around what it is. And so I'm going to give you a bit of that context as we go through this. This book is a New York Times and a #1 Wall Street Journal bestseller, and we're really happy about that. So we'll dive in here and get into how we define trust as a bit of a context setter. So I'm going to make some definitions here, and then we'll dive into some of the data. We believe that trust is the confidence. Those words are used interchangeably in a lot of foreign languages, by the way. Trust is confidence in many different languages. And it's born of both the character and the competence of a person or an organization. Trust is not simply a function of integrity, right? Most people would say trust is honesty. Well, that's part of it, but it's only a small part of it. There's a character part of it, and there's a competence part of it. And that's important to know. The opposite of trust, as we define it, is suspicion. So, good language we're going to tie back to in just a few minutes. This is a really important quote that helps set context for the meeting today. Trust is the most overlooked, misunderstood, underutilized asset a leader can access to enable performance. And its impact, for good or bad, is dramatic and pervasive. It's something you can't escape. I think we all agree with that. It makes a lot of sense. So, again, a little more context here. From a business or from an organizational standpoint, trust always impacts 2 measurable outcomes. There's a quantitative impact in that it impacts the speed at which work, or efficiency in a government context, the speed at which work gets accomplished, and the subsequent cost. I'm going to talk about that a little more in just a moment. The qualitative impact is something we all know about. It impacts our energy and our level of joy. So think about a time when you've been around a low-trust, toxic person for an extended period of time. What happens? We get exhausted, it's wearing, it drains our energy. And so on the flip side, people that are high-trust people who are inspiring energize us. So 2 really important definitions, and the quantitative side of it is really what I want to focus on more than the qualitative side. The idea of getting more efficient as an organization has a whole lot to do with the levels of trust in the culture. And it comes at a cost, or it doesn't come at a cost, depending on where we're at. So when trust is low, what happens to speed? This is the interactive part. Speed goes down, what happens to costs?
Cost goes up.
There's the economic formula. That's half of the economic formula. And we call a low trust environment like that a group of people that are experiencing some significant trust taxes. Okay, and the other side of the formula is when trust is high, speed goes up, costs go down. Pretty straightforward, simple, but most people don't look at trust through this kind of lens. And so we call this a trust dividend. So as we get into your data, we had 115 people respond to the survey. We surveyed 6 different departments, which I'm going to show you in just a moment. I'm going to show you today the overall aggregate data from those 6 departments, everything rolled together. But you can see it from a county-wide perspective, and that's where we'll go today. However, let me start with this one slide. It might be a little hard to see. This particular slide shows an overall speed of trust index. So think of a speedometer from 0 to 100. When we talk about speed of trust, this is an index that gives us a numerical value behind how efficient, for example, we may be in getting work done. And it's a function of 2 things, primarily. A function of credibility, which we're going to talk about a little bit in just a moment, and a function of behaviors or relationship. And there's 13 behaviors we're going to talk about in just a moment. You'll see Wasatch County is the blue line, and there's a top 10% that comes in with the green line. And so you can see how you stack up against the top 10%. So with credibility, you're at 76 compared to 86 as the top 10%. Relationship trust, 77 compared to 81. And then organizational trust, 43 compared to 63. And I would say be careful not to look at this number like you would getting graded at school. 65 would not be considered a very good grade at school, but we look at it more in the context of the top 10%. So I would say, from my experience, this is a pretty darn good number.
And the top 10% made up of government entities, or the made up of all?
All government entities we've done work with. Only government.
But not private.
Not private.
So that's what our top, on this one.
Yep. And so the spread between the top 10% compared to where you are, I would say is pretty darn good. We're going to drill down. We're going to drill. My goodness. We're going to drill down quite a bit right here and right here, and cover some good data and give you some tools and things to think about as we go through that. Here's all the departments. So you can see how all of them, when they're all aggregated, come in around 65, right? The slide I just showed you. So you can see there are some that are overperforming, some that are underperforming, and that's telling. That's an indicator. Those that are not performing as well are an indicator there's some work that needs to be done there relative to trust. And again, I'm going to give you some tools and some context on what that can look like. Other thoughts about this before we move on?
Who's in the other category?
Mike, you want to speak to that? Do you remember who's in that other category?
I believe it were departments.
I believe it was were the departments that had less than 5 or so, or was it 3?
Less than 5.
And
So the county manager, the HR, planning, the surveyor.
all of the departments that aren't listed up there, that are departments of the county, would be in other, if they're not listed up there, the ones that just have few employees, and it just wouldn't, it doesn't work well with just a couple of people in the department.
To preserve anonymity, we have to have a certain number of people in the survey that take the survey or won't even print. We can't even access that. So there's some good information. To me, this is really good feedback for your various heads of your departments. And we can look a little closer at each one, but we're going to take more of an aggregate look at the whole. We measured the trust levels, and here's what we came up with. Sorry, those are a little out of order. I was in a hurry. And 7 different descriptors, right? From everywhere from no trust all the way to world-class trust. And you can see, 4.3% say there's no trust, and so on and so forth. 7% very low trust, 9.6% low trust. A whopping 41.7% say there's some trust issues. I would be worried about that particular number if it showed up in the low trust or very low trust space. So the fact that you're right in the middle is actually okay from my perspective. And trust is not an issue. Trust is a visible asset. I don't know if you can see through me there, but world-class trust, 7.8% of the people say we're doing great. So
This is across all of the county
all
response.
the counties. So all I'm going to show you from now on is countywide data, not specific to any one department.
Okay.
Okay? So what does this mean? Some trust issues exist. I pulled this right from the report. This is the question that was that they weighed in on. I just pulled this one. In the team or organization, some bureaucratic rules and procedures, unnecessary hierarchy, slow approvals, misaligned systems and structures, some dissatisfied employees, in personal relationships, regular misunderstandings, concerns about intent and motive, interactions characterized by tension, communications colored by fear, and certainly doubt, energy spent maintaining instead of growing relationships. This is a very typical place, as I've worked with lots of different government organizations. This is really typical, and this is not bad news. It just says there's some work to be done. We're going to get deeper into some of the data, which will be even more meaningful than this one. So let's talk. I'm going to give you a little bit of context for how this works. So when we look at any organization anywhere, we know that there are what we call 5 waves of trust. And if you drop a pebble in a pool of water, you're going to see some waves ripple out from that. It always starts with self-trust, which is all about credibility. It is impossible to grow trust in an environment if people therein are less than credible. So I'm going to talk, part of what we measured, as you remember earlier, was credibility, and we're going to dive into what that looks like in just a minute. Relationship trust is about behavior. We're going to talk about that as well. Organizational trust is about alignment. Market trust is about reputation. And finally, societal trust is really all about contribution, giving back to our communities, making a difference. So we're going to focus on the first 2 primarily, self-trust and relationship trust. I wanted to give you that bit of context. High trust is a function, a high trust culture is a function of the credibility of your leaders, period. It's all about credibility. Credibility, you have trust. You don't have credibility, you don't have trust. It's also a function of the behavior of your people. Credibility and behavior. So if we dive into this idea of credibility, this self-trust wave, we look at